This lockdown was preceded, Desiree, by a 14-hour self-imposed voluntary curfew at the behest of the Prime Minister, where on Sunday you had 1.3 billion Indians staying indoors, not coming out unless they worked for essential services like the health or the police force. And I can tell you that was an unlikely sight for anyone who's ever visited India or lived in India, because there was an eerie calm in the air. There were no cars on the roads. And what we saw after that self-imposed curfew ended, though, was a lot of people coming back out onto the streets, once again indulging in panic buying of groceries. A lot of people are worried about what's going to happen, how long this COVID-19 situation is going to play out. In light of that, the Indian government imposed extensive restrictions, including putting 80 Indian cities across 75 districts in lockdown. This includes the national capital. And we've just heard from the Prime Minister a short while back. He has responded to many people not adhering to this lockdown, trying to come out onto the streets, go about their daily business, try and go to work. He has now empowered officials to arrest and take legal action against anyone defying lockdown rules in any of these 80 cities. And he has urged Indians to realize how important the next 2 weeks are, that this could make or break India's fight against COVID-19. But while in some sections we are seeing people come out, largely people do seem to be abiding by this lockdown, primarily because nearly all commercial establishments in Delhi and most parts of India have shut down for the next week and a half. And as many people as possible are trying to work from home. But important to remember that India is also home to millions of poor people who rely on working daily, their daily wage earners for their living. And these are the people who are still out and about, hoping to put together enough money for one meal a day.
What is being put in place to mitigate the effects of the lockdown, especially in relation to access to food, as you say?
In Delhi, we've seen quite extensive measures being announced by the government. The Delhi government has said that it's going to provide 2 meals a day to anyone who needs that kind of support at night shelters in the city. The government has also announced an economic scheme to help out the poor. There's going to be a cash transfer to people to encourage them to stay at home to protect themselves and their families. But we're not seeing similar measures being announced for the rest of the country. The Prime Minister addressed the nation a few days ago, where he did say that an economic task force would be set up. This would be helmed by the country's finance minister. And the understanding is that eventually the government of India will also implement something like this nationwide. It's unclear whether this cash payout scheme will only benefit certain sections of society, or we're looking at universal basic income perhaps for everyone who's been impacted by this. But the government says it's looking at the financial impact of coronavirus very seriously, especially for India, because it's important to remember that the country is growing at a 6-year low. It's already been grappling with unemployment figures that are 4-decade high. So it's quite important and urgent that the government address this particular crisis when it comes to the economy as soon as possible.
In terms of enforcement, Neha, what sort of sentences can we see being effected by law enforcement officials if people break the rules?
So, for example, in Delhi, to try and ensure that people don't get out, the government has imposed prohibitory orders. It's a section 144 under the Indian Penal Code, which essentially limits any gathering of people to just 5. Any more people in a group more than that can be taken into preventive custody. And that's what we're likely to see right now as far as enforcement is concerned. A lot of people who are out and about are telling me that if they're spotted by the police force, and if they don't have a justifiable reason for being out and about, they are being asked to turn back and go back home. Many videos being circulated online of the police actually using bait and charging to get people to go back into their homes as well, to try and keep the streets as empty as possible. But of course, as we head into uncharted territory, as we head into an unpredictable period of how long this lockdown will be, we'll just have to wait and see how the government continues to enforce this. Whether or not preventive detention is going to be enough, will they need to take more measures, is something that we'll only know in the days ahead.
India and China have some of the biggest populations in the world, running into the billions per country. do we feel like the lockdown will be effective?
That's the biggest concern, because when you look at the Indian subcontinent and India in particular, you have some of the highest population density in the world. You have millions of people living in very close, cramped quarters, literally cheek by jowl. And that is the concern, because right now the government says that there is no community transmission, which means this coronavirus is not spreading unchecked from person to person. It's only being transferred from someone who's returned from international travel recently, or someone who's actually tested positive to COVID-19 coming into contact with someone else. But the fact that we have such high population density is the concern. It's why the Prime Minister has also spoken out. It's why he's reminded people that you need to stay indoors. Social distancing and self-isolation is the only thing that can work. It's why the restrictions are so very strict. For example, in Delhi, the lockdown means that literally everything is shut. You've got gyms, museums, cinema halls, commercial establishments. Everything is completely shut. The shutters are down. The only thing you can access are, let's say, grocery stores, pharmacies, hospitals, doctors, the ATM perhaps, and petrol stations as well. So with these extensive restrictions, governments are hoping people will stay indoors, but it's not really working as well as you would imagine it to. For example, just a short while back, I saw a picture on Twitter of people boarding state transport buses. Now, they're doing this because India's extensive rail network, one of the largest in the world, has been shut down. It sees 23 million people traveling every day. With the railway is no longer an option, people are taking buses. And the reason why they're doing this, there are a lot of migrant laborers who work in different parts of the country. Many of them are trying to get back home. Some are trying to find living in other parts of the country where the lockdown hasn't been enforced. So it's a complicated question in a country which has a very, very high population density and millions living in poverty.
At an individual level, how are you coping with the lockdown, and what sort of changes have you effected in your life to cope?
It's been an anxious few days, I can tell you that, and anyone in any country where the COVID outbreak has happened, I'm sure will agree with me as well. For one, I'm working from home, as the bookcase behind me tells you. My entire family is in self-isolation. No one in our family has shown any symptoms yet or has come into contact with anyone who had COVID-19 recently, but we're taking all precautions that we possibly can, of course, following government directives to limit our movement. We're only going out when we need to get basic grocery supplies, even then avoiding markets that might be very crowded. My husband's also working from home, and we have a dog. We're only taking him out when he needs to be taken for a walk. But it is very trying to work in these circumstances, because you're constantly switched on, as I'm sure you can imagine, and constantly trying to stay ahead of the news and keep a tab on what's happening outside.
Neha, in terms of diplomacy, we've seen tensions between the US and China rising, with the US president calling COVID-19 the Chinese virus. The US president was recently in India, and one would imagine that the relations there are quite cordial at the moment. What is being said from an official point of view at that level in terms of relations between India and the US in the times of COVID-19?
India-US ties have been cordial. In fact, right before Donald Trump came to India, the ties had hit a rough patch over differences on trade issues. Donald Trump repeatedly calling India tariff king, saying that India's import tariffs on American products are very unfair. But once he was here, both sides seemed to bury that hatchet, and we saw a lot of camaraderie between Donald Trump and Prime Minister Modi. As far as allegations of this being a virus that originated in China, allegations of the nomenclature needing to refer to this as the Wuhan virus, we are hearing similar suggestions from some quarters in India. There are many groups who are demanding that this be referred to as the Wuhan virus instead of coronavirus. The government has not taken a position on this because it's important to also view this entire crisis geopolitically. China is India's neighbor. India shares a 4,000 kilometer long boundary with China. A lot of it is currently disputed, and that's always been a huge concern for both sides. Now, in order to not upset China, the Indian government has not taken a position on this particular issue, but at the same time, it's not commenting on what Donald Trump is saying in the United States either.
What is being said in terms of sport? We know that the South African cricket team was recently in India in a hotel where there were reports of infections. Tell us about that.
That's right. This is something that just came to light 24 hours ago, and it's an interesting case that just highlights how important social distancing is. It all started with a Bollywood singer who had recently returned from the United Kingdom, and after she landed in Delhi, she went to another city called Lucknow, which is in India's most populated state of Uttar Pradesh. There, she stayed at a hotel, the same hotel where the South African team was also staying, incidentally, their stay overlapping with this Bollywood singer's as well. And it's now come to light that a few days after she returned, she attended a massive party in the city, which was attended by many Indian politicians, and she's just recently tested positive for COVID-19. Now, what health officials are now doing are trying to trace everyone she came into contact with. It so turns out that politicians she met had interacted later with India's president, who's now gone into self-isolation as a precautionary measure. Politicians she met also attended parliamentary proceedings, which is why there's now demand that parliament be shut down to try and limit the spread of this virus if in fact she has passed it on to other people. We don't quite know yet whether she had any direct interaction with the South African cricket team while they were staying at the hotel, but we do know that she was in common areas, for example, the lobby where she attended to and met many guests. She was in restaurants in the hotel as well, and the government's trying to ascertain everyone she came into contact with. CCTV footage of the hotel is now being examined as well.
Neha, thank you so much for that update.